Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. Today, my guest is Patrick Chung, an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland. We'll be talking about two of his recent essays, as well as the larger book project they're a part of. Patrick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Instead of diving directly into your essays, I thought it might be helpful to give listeners a sense of the larger project you're working on. So, could you tell us a bit about building global capitalism?
Yeah, so my larger book project looks at the role of the US military in the global economy, and it does so by examining sort of South Korea, both as a site for the development of global capitalism as sort of this exemplary case study. I think a lot of people see and think about South Korea today as this really high tech exporter of technologies and increasingly pop culture, which I
Yeah.
find to be quite amazing given growing up how being Korean wasn't necessarily the coolest thing, but now with bands like BTS, it is very much in
Yeah.
vogue. So they think about South Korea in those terms. However, after World War II, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world.
Hmm.
So my project initially began with that sort of problem. How was it that South Korea was able to transform itself when there are so many other examples of sort of decolonizing nations not quite achieving the same level of economic development
Yeah.
and sort of technological sort of advancement. And over the course of my research, the US military just showed up everywhere. I like went into the project thinking that I would look at records of mostly, policymakers, potentially business people, but actually it was military officials and some of
Huh.
them, many of whom I've never heard of before, like
Yeah.
engineers and sort of the middle management
Hmm.
of US military operations in South Korea. So over the course of the project, I've really sort of developed this argument that the US military, particularly through its relationships with South Korean businesses and patronage of South Korean sort of research, development, production, distribution networks, really played a central role in not only sort of South Korea's emergence, but I hope to make this argument in the larger book project that's sort of part of a larger phenomenon where the US military played this essential role of integrating
Hmm.
economies around the world during the Cold War.
Yeah. I mean, South Korea is known as, what used to be called the Asian Tigers, this set of Asian nations that kind of their economies grew very quickly in the post World War II period. And your faculty page says that, your project, you traces the impact of the U.S. miraculous in quotation marks growth of the South Korean economy. And miracle is a word you hear thrown around, or like these Asian tiger, so-called Asian tiger nations, like all the time. So is one of your findings that maybe this growth was not so miraculous, or that it wasn't a miracle in the end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have two thoughts. First, initially, it was in square quotes because I was interested not in particularly putting forth another narrative about South Korea being this sort of exemplary case and sort of a
Hmm.
success story unambiguously. That I think a lot of sort of literature about sort of US developmental assistance and nation building efforts, particularly
Yeah.
from the US government, sort of purports South Korea as. In a lot of ways, South Korea's economic development went along went or along with it came a lot of negative
Yeah.
consequences, not only sort of for people in South Korea, but around the world, right? So sort
Yep.
of, I was most interested in some of the labor issues that surrounded
Hmm.
South Korea's economic growth. Sort of the exportation of South Korean products went hand in hand with the exploitation of workers in South Korea,
Yeah.
right? So I think sort of exploring some of the dark sides of South Korea's economic growth was one of the reasons for putting miraculous in square quotes.
Yeah.
And another one is sort of talking, I think this term, sort of like Watergate, is often bandied about in different contexts, right? Sort of to describe rapid economic growth, particularly that which occurred during the Cold War. So I think one of the first instances was actually talking about Germany immediately
Yeah.
after World War II. And sort of what's interesting is a lot of the places where this quote unquote miraculous economic growth occurred, the US military was actually
Yeah.
a big part of in terms of
Yeah.
its sort of presence there. So Germany, Japan, South Korea, I think a lot of these different nations that became, I think, sort of the leading industrial economies in sort of the capitalist free world, um, did so partially because of the US military's presence and sort of, I would argue, the US military's uh, spending and defense dollars. And sort of those are sort of, I think, the two aspects of the story that I really want to highlight in sort of saying miraculous growth of South Korea.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. So one thing I like to do in this podcast is kind of give listeners a sense uh, of scholars as human beings. So like how did you get into this topic?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting story because I gave you sort of a small part of the unexpected nature of this project with the military.
Yeah.
But coming into grad school, I was most interested in looking at Asian American history, sort of growing up. Uh, the son of immigrants, sort of Korean American, I really became fascinated by the fact that there was a history of Asian Americans and people were writing about it as I was writing my undergraduate thesis. And I was interested in this idea that it was actually Chinese workers who were trying to sneak across the Mexican border during the turn of the 20th century. And that sort of was what my undergrad thesis was about. And I
Hmm.
sort of fully expected to write about that in grad school. But for very practical reasons, on one hand, I couldn't speak Chinese really well enough to work with sources
Yeah.
or Spanish, which actually made me start to look around for other potential topics. I did speak Korean, and like I said, my parents were immigrants to the US. And just those two things actually made me naturally gravitate towards South Korea and looking at South Korean history. Um, and then over the course of doing readings for my exams, I got interested in this these parallel stories that I didn't see being talked about in this single framework. One is this rapid economic growth that you see in countries throughout East Asia, South Korea being one of them. And the other deindustrialization that was going on in the United States. To me, those stories just sort of on an instinctive level seem like obviously tied together.
Yeah.
But over the course of my research, I really uh, looked for ways or found that it wasn't as simple. It wasn't a one-to-one relationship where I could talk about sort of find sources that talked about, factories moving directly from the United States
Yeah.
to South Korea, for instance, which is what I was looking at. So it was really through kind of those struggles that this story about the US military really came to the forefront in a lot of ways. Since completing that research and writing the dissertation, I've been looking at sort of more the kind of interesting everyday ways in which that relationship translates, and I think it's really appropriate to talk about with you just because I've become really interested in the history of technology, right? I think one of the
Hmm.
things that is really interesting to think about is just sort of not only the flow of products and materials back and forth from the United States to South Korea and abroad, but also the production of these materials, right? I think
Yeah.
that's really became the focus of my research and really is actually what has held my interest, the ways in which the production of materials, which we think about occurring in sort of a single site, single factory. They sort of take the materials, put together, really becomes dispersed throughout the
Yes.
world, right? And I
That's
think
right.
that's one thing that I've been trying to find ways to articulate to people, and sort of using South Korea as this sort of very specific example, but kind of as an important node in this sort of larger diaspora, and this is not the right word for it, but diaspora of production, right? So looking at South Korea as a way to get into these, what are today really sort of global, and sort of a global network with people and locations and capital involved all around the world.
Yeah. Maybe we could transition here to talking about your essay From Korea to Vietnam, which appeared in Radical History. The subtitle is Local Labor, Multinational Capital, and the Evolution of Military Logistics. And I feel like a helpful bit of background for this essay is how historians so far have talked about the history of shipping containers and containerization. So do you want to kind of can you outline kind of the story of containerization as it's kind of existed before you wrote this essay?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got my introduction, like a lot of people, to that scholarship from Mark Levinson's The Box, which is a great book that really talks about containerization, I think, from a global perspective, but in a lot of ways, the central players are sort of American, right? He talks about the ways in which sort of Malcolm McLean and a lot of shippers in the United States really helped bring about this globalization of shipping, right? The ability to produce products almost anywhere and have them consumed wherever in the world. And I think in some ways, the book is great for really mapping out that trajectory, and also in a lot of ways highlighting the role and partnership between corporations and the US military in making this a global phenomenon. And I think from there, there are different sort of focuses I found that have talked about this story. One of them is the story about labor, right? So containerization, while great for consumers, has actually been devastating for a lot of workers in the various logistical industries, right? So stevedores being the most obvious example, right? So mechanization being a way to lower wages or sort of completely eliminate jobs. So there's this rich labor history, which I actually found to be, quite interesting, and sort of something that I hoped my work could add a little bit of context to, because sort of in contrast to those histories that in a lot of ways focus on the United States and sort of Western Europe, many of the major players being from those countries, I wanted the article to look at South Korean players in containerization, because one of the major kind of success stories of the South Korean economy was sort of logistics firms, Hanjin being the company that I talk about in the article. You might be more familiar with Korean Airlines, which is part, or was once a part of, sort of that larger Hanjin group. But Hanjin became, by the late 1990s and the early 2000s, one of the largest container shippers in the world, like one of the largest shipping companies in the world, right? So, so through that process, and by looking at containerization in Hanjin, I kind of broadly wanted to sort of outline the argument that I've been talking to you about throughout this podcast, but also show that how non-Western companies actually were central to this process of containerization. And what I think I focused on particularly in that article was not only the technology of containerization, but sort of the larger capitalist logic that went behind it, right? So one of the things that I trace from Korea to Vietnam, a little bit about the title, just sort of the evolution of logistical systems between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. One of them that isn't really an evolution, is sort of more of a transplantation, is the use of sort of race as a way to categorize different workers, and sort of, on one hand, maximize profits, but on the other, I think, really sort of weaponize this sort of US and Western views of race, right? And what's most interesting for me in that story is it's actually sort of the Koreans Hanjin that's actually taking on a lot of these sort of racialized ideas uh, in terms of using it in its relationships with workers, right? So the story begins during the Korean War, where you see the U.S. military as well as U.S. military contractors employ a racialized wage system that puts South Koreans at the bottom, right? And it makes sense to a certain extent because there's a large pool of Korean workers that are displaced by the war, and they sort of fit into this U.S. defense effort by sort of doing the menial tasks involved
Hmm.
in logistics, which are actually critical to the war effort, right? So unloading ships that have war material as well as essential goods. So this system gets employed by Koreans who become contractors during the Vietnam War, right? And they employ the same differentiated hierarchical system of labor relations, and I think I think is why I sort of highlighted that literature about sort of the working class and their relationships with containerization,
Yeah.
because I really think that my work really shows the sort of global nature of this process.
Yeah, and so just to spell out the racial logic a bit, which I think you do really well in the article, you know, for instance, there's Japanese managers, and of course the US has relations with Japan coming out of World War II, and is used to working with them in some degree, and they're given higher wages than the kind of Korean laborers who are doing the grunt work, right? As one example of the kind of racial logic that plays out there.
Yeah, and it like reminded me of this sort of quote that's attributed to a prime minister of Japan. It describes the Korean War as sort of a miracle sent from the gods, from the heavens. And in a lot of ways it was, because Japan despite being an enemy of the United States during World War II, was actually uh, emerged as the United States' most important ally throughout the Cold War. And part of the reason for that was the fact that it had the industrial base and sort of the experience and the sort of corporate um, organization that many of the sort of decolonizing countries around the Pacific didn't have, right? So it sort of fit logically into this US world order, where it would sort of have key allies help oversee sort of the US sort of spread of US influence, right? And during the Korean War, Japan and Japanese companies became sort of the sort of prime contractors in a lot of instances, right? Where they would be overseeing Korean workers doing a wide range of sort of large projects. And I think in the larger book project, I really show how South Korea became a huge boon, not only for Japan, but also companies from Western Europe. So the former colonizers throughout the world really found opportunities in sort of the reconstruction of the decolonizing world, and sort of that relationship sort of evolves over the course of the Cold War, where you have newly emerging, newly developing countries like South Korea sort of enter into this hierarchical system, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really sort of something that I hope my work adds to this understanding of the East Asian tigers, right? It was
Yeah.
like an outgrowth of this larger trajectory, but also sort of the exploitative nature that a lot of this economic development sort of relied upon.
Yeah. I thought you really effectively used the story of I might botch this, but Cho Chung Hoon, the founder of the Hanjin Corporation. I just thought it was a fascinating story, and so can you tell us a bit about Cho and how he got started in this whole project, which eventually becomes this enormous conglomerate, but actually starts out quite small.
Yeah, I found him to be like a fascinating way to look at the story, because in a lot of ways, like South Korea, he's held up as this model of why sort of capitalism works, right? So he was very sort of Horatio Alger, pull himself up by the bootstrap story. He started as a small shipping or sort of trucking company out of Incheon, which is the port city that's west of Seoul. And really, and his company took off moving supplies for the U.S. military during the Korean War and its immediate aftermath, right? And this is a story that is actually very parallel to a much larger, well-known corporation, the Hyundai Corporation. Chung, like Joe, actually began with a very sort of small mom and pop operation. But through this early recognition of the opportunity that the U.S. military and U.S. military contracts provided, was able to transform these very local small companies into gigantic multinational corporations, right? So in the case of Hanjin, sort of initial wartime trucking jobs turned into sort of more long-term logistics contracts with the U.S. military in South Korea. And then during the Vietnam War, one of the sort of preconditions for South Korea becoming a key, sort of the key ally of the United States in the war. Actually, South Korea sent the largest number of troops outside the United States to fight in Vietnam. One of the key provisions that the South Korean government negotiated with the United States was to provide preferential treatment to South Korean contractors, right? So that's sort of how Hanjin got its foot in the door. It had this existing relationship with the US military. Thus, it was a logical choice when South Korea began to send troops and sort of logistical support to the US military in Vietnam, it would be selected. And really, it was in Vietnam where Hanjin really began to get the sort of scope of capital and access to advanced technology, specifically container technology, or exposure and experience with these technologies to become sort of a worldwide shipping company, right?
Yeah. I thought you also did a really good job in the article kind of showing how exploitative a lot of this work was in South Korea. So can you give listeners a sense of that? I mean, just like how badly were workers being treated in many of these cases?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's often pointed out about South Korea is that the workers are sort of the best in the world. It's like really
Yeah.
interesting in one of the biographies of Chung, who's the founder of Hyundai. There was a quote by a U.S. military official during the 1950s just praising Korean workers, right? So
Yep.
they work these really long hours and really sort of have this work ethic that's often not seen in the United States anymore, right? So it's always comparative. And in a lot of ways, this was true during the 70s and 80s. South Korean workers worked among the longest hours in the world for comparatively lower wages. But sort of the truth about some of these narratives that are often spun in positive ways of this hard work paying off with South Korea taking off and developing was that, they just really didn't have any recourse to the demands of management, right? South
Yeah.
Korea, for most of its history, post-war history, was run by a series of military authoritarian dictatorships who sided with often corporations. The corporations often worked hand in hand with the South Korean government at the expense of the workers, right? So the reason
Yeah.
why South Koreans were working the longest hours for the lowest pay wasn't this sort of tradition, often sort of attributed to Confucianism,
Yeah.
of hard work, but rather these very material conditions and sort of the heavy-handedness of the South Korean government in enforcing labor relations. And sort of the reasoning for it that was given was sort of the need to develop the country. But the fact of the matter was South Koreans were working 10, 12, 13-hour days in, manual labor, right?
Yeah.
For sort of pennies on the dime, or pennies
Yeah, like
compared
five
to
cents an hour,
American.
you say at one
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. So I
Wild.
think that's really sort of pretty, yeah, I think an important part of the story that often is overlooked.
Yeah. I guess there unionization efforts, or was that just like stamped out whenever it would pop up?
Yeah, and I think the thing about the unions in South Korea is they were very much working with the South Korean state. I think
Yeah.
there, at least in the initial post World War II period, there was this groundswell of more left wing demands for redistribution among the workers, and there were efforts to unionize uh, along non-corporatist unions, but like I said, South Korea, often with the support of the U.S. and the U.S. military, stamped out a lot of the more radical elements
Hmm.
within the South Korean uh, workers' movement. And by the time of the 70s, the sort of largest official unions were sort of relied upon and worked closely with the South Korean state, right? So.
Yeah. So, is part of your argument that the kind of infrastructure and practices maybe built in South Korea during the time we've been talking about, like the Korean War to the through the Vietnam War, is kind of like was set up and then could be led to increased economic growth after the war? Like they could then use that capacity for kind of more peaceful economic ends. Is that part of the picture you're painting?
Yeah, I think that is a good way to put it. I don't know if I think I might choose a different word than peaceful, but
Yeah,
this
yeah,
sort of evolution. I think one of the historical developments I really want to trace is how supply lines, and this is sort of the title for a chapter in another book chapter that I published. This evolution from supply lines to supply chains, because I think this need to be able to transport goods around the world in an efficient manner is actually something that is, you know, a central concern for the US military
yeah.
as well as corporations today, right? So, in a lot of
Hmm.
ways, the US military's role in at least in establishing a lot of these systems, if not sort of building the actual systems that are employed uh, in later decades, is critical for the emergence of transnational corporations, right?
Yeah.
So, the sort of wartime demands, I start with the Korean War, but it actually goes back further, definitely to World War II, where the U.S. military was building out this network, worldwide network of bases, and the infrastructure needed to maintain and connect them, right? And so, in a lot of ways, the corporate transnational supply chains that our economy today relies upon really sort of piggybacked off this effort of the U.S. military. At least that's sort of the argument that I'm trying to make in the larger book project.
Yeah. I think this is a great point to tack to your other essay, from ham radio to microchips. Um, so one way, as we've just kind of discussed, one way to think about what we've been talking about so far is that it's the story of the rise of infrastructure and logistics, about how to move things around. But there's also an important story to be told about South Korea, about what was being moved out of South Korea eventually, that played a role in its economic growth. So the subtitle of the essay is Kang Ki Dong, the U.S. military and the rise of global high tech. So maybe we could start with, who is Kang Ki Dong? Life tell us about these larger issues.
Yeah, Kang is another really fascinating individual that I came across when researching a potential second project. So, this first project that we've been talking about looks at sort of heavy industries as well as infrastructure. But obviously, the other half of it, and I think more well known half of sort of South Korea, the South Korean economy is this sort of high tech sector. And it was sort of a potential second project, I wanted to look at the globalization of South Korean tech companies, and Samsung being the most prominent one. So, in the course of reading a little bit about Samsung's entry into the semiconductor industry, which was really one of the sort of key components of its business, particularly during the initial takeoff phase during the 80s and 90s, but still today. I came across this sort of footnote really in a lot of different pieces about Samsung about this a company called Korea Semiconductor, and this man Kang was mentioned in a few of them. I didn't see much else written about him, so I did a little bit of digging and found this really fascinating story, like you said, about sort of circulation that occurred between Korea and the United States that enabled high-tech industries to really take root in South Korea. And I thought Kang helped me sort of talk about a lot of these trans-Pacific connections. So Kang actually was the founder of, like I said, Korea Semiconductor, and it was one of the sort of it was the first firm that was able to produce and design its own sort of advanced semiconductors during the late 1970s. Prior to that point, South Korean companies have been involved in various electronics, but it was mostly in assembling and mass producing sort of consumer facing chips. And what Kang brought to the table was the ability to design some of the cutting edge semiconductors that actually were sort of being produced in the United States and Japan at the time.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit disorganized here, but that's who Kang is, and he's sort
Yeah.
of important in the history of Samsung because his company was acquired by Samsung as it was entering into the semiconductor industry, and he actually helped provide some of the initial technological expertise needed for Samsung to really emerge as this global power in the industry. So that's sort of how I initially became interested in him. But as I got to digging into his backstory, I sort of found a lot of interesting
Yeah.
connections to my previous research because he was born in Korea during the colonial period. So he was born before Korea became liberated from Japanese colonialism after World War II. But he grew up in various parts of Korea, but mostly in Seoul. But what really caught my attention is he grew up in and around sort of U.S. military presence. It was like sort of omnipresent part of his and many Koreans' life, particularly when it came to consuming just any goods, right? So
Yeah.
his memoir has a lot of stories about him rummaging junkyards that had U.S. surplus military electronics,
Huh.
and it's really in one of these junkyards he really begins to sort of understand what technology is or sort of electronics are. And he sort of develops this fascination with ham radio,
Yeah.
which I found to be fascinating because a lot of the more sort of US focused histories of high tech and Silicon Valley talk about this sort of, for me, kind of like a weird, sort of very niche technology, but how central it was
Yeah.
for a lot of the key players in Silicon Valley. So I was just like fascinated that this sort of displaced, relatively well off for in South Korean terms, but in US terms, very poor individual became introduced to ham radio, the same ham radio being used by in the United States through US military bases. So sort of through
Yeah.
surplus electronics, he gets interested in ham radio. And then from there, he sort of enters into the most prestigious university at the time, and still arguably today in South Korea, Seoul National University. And there he enters the electrical engineering department with the hopes of sort of pursuing his passion for not ham radio necessarily, but communications technology, right? So sort of
Yeah.
what's fascinating there for me too is the electrical engineering department at Seoul National University would not be there without sort of the support of the U.S. military. So
Uh,
following the Korean War, the U.S. military is involved in sort of rebuilding the education system in South Korea, and it prioritized sort of electronics and sort of technical fields that would help uh, South Korea be able to sort of support itself economically, right? So
I
sort of
bet it was very electricity industry focused initially, right? It was probably very power focused.
yeah, and that's something that he noted, and also other Korean engineers who sort of went to Seoul National University at the time noted is just power generation was
Yeah.
central for South Korea because South Korea didn't have sort of a robust power infrastructure system,
Yeah.
right? So the U.S. in sort of its foreign assistance to South Korea, prioritized power generation as well as sort of other sort of very basic utilities or engineers who could actually service and work for various infrastructures and utilities.
Yeah.
And for that reason, electrical engineering was sort of uh, prioritized by the U.S. military, but not in sort of the sort of cutting edge side
Yes.
that would sort of look at things like semiconductors. And it's for this very reason that Kang actually, following graduation, goes to the United States, right? So he's
Yeah.
really sort of fortunate in the timing of his graduation. Just as he graduates, there's sort of this big push in the United States under Eisenhower to beef up science and technology. This is following Sputnik, and there's this sort of fear that the United States is falling behind technologically. What you see, sort of in a more practical sense, is funding for STEM fields in the United States really blowing up, and sort of Kang is able to piggyback off that process. He becomes a grad student, and he works in one of the earlier sort of semiconductor research labs at Ohio State University. And it's really there that he enters the field and he becomes sort of a leading expert in the production of semiconductors, right? Following OSU, he works for Motorola, which briefly becomes the largest producer of semiconductor devices in the United States. So, I mean, what I sort of try and draw out in this article is this global trajectory of technological development that sort of has the US military involved in various ways. That's what I really want
Yeah.
to highlight, and what I thought Kang was such a great example of, because the US military's patronage of high technology, I think, has been talked about a lot, and particularly recently in the
Yeah.
literature. Like, I think I read Margaret O'Mara's The Code recently, and it
Yeah.
does like a really good job, sort of, I think,
This is
providing
a
this
book
sort of.
about the history of Silicon Valley for people who
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I like a lot of these stories, and I think it's really interesting, sort of looking at some of the work from the U.S. perspective. But like I did with the From Korea to Vietnam article, there's sort of an international story to be told,
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting once you sort of look at the South Korean example is how there were so many different sort of linkage points between the U.S. military and various and individuals like Kang would play a big role in the development of the South Korean sort of high tech sector, right? So from the very indirect, by having sort of surplus electronics as well as various technical manuals
Yeah.
being available at junk shops, to its patronage of the education system,
Yeah.
to sort of its patronage of foreign students in the United States, right? One thing that I sort of
Yeah.
encountered in looking at Kang is just how there is a prevalence of sort of key figures in technology, or at least the semiconductor industry, that enter the United States from countries like South Korea, sort of potential allies in the fight against communism, and sort of these grad students who enter the United States and play key
Yeah.
roles in the development of key technologies, right? So in a lot of
Yes.
ways, I focus on Kang, but hopefully his story is actually sort of resonates with people who are looking at other places and regions of the world.
Yeah. No, I think it does in all kinds of ways. I mean, just going back to the ham radio thing for a second, it's true that if you look at the history of computers, like there's that textbook, multi-authored textbook by Martin Campbell Kelly et al. Um, ham radios play an important part in the computer story, in that it's like geeky, mostly white guys playing with these things, and then starting the computer industry eventually. But the other place it touched a nerve for me when I was reading your essay is that in David Edgerton's Shock of the Old, in his chapter on maintenance, he has a really fascinating, I think it might just be a paragraph and a footnote. He's drawing on others' research, but it's about how in some instances, I think in both Japan and South Korea, you have industries coming out of maintenance and tinkering of like American imported goods, right? I mean, that this is where's the technical wherewithal to innovate, going to come from? Well, it's going to come initially from people learning how to play with these things that are around suddenly that weren't, created locally, but then they end up in some cases creating whole new industries. So that's kind of fascinating connection there, I thought.
Yeah, and sort of that idea, and this is something that I really wasn't familiar with before working on this essay, was this notion of tinkering, right? So sort of
Yeah.
that idea of this sort of independence and freedom found through sort of exploration and sort of
Yeah.
going away from the manual, which I find so striking in comparison to sort of the modern day, where everything, I think, is actually sort of that the ability to tinker is increasingly becoming more
Yeah, it's
difficult.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think about that when I talked to sort of my dad's generation about cars, how they could actually open the hood and like work on their
Yeah.
car in a way that I think more modern cars, you would need to be sort of a computer engineer to, in some ways, to work on cars today. So
Yeah.
I think that's like, and that was interesting looking into that. And I think in a lot of ways, it's something that I hope to explore a little bit more in my future work. Like I said, I'm
Yeah.
a novice, I think, or I'm really just beginning my
You're doing
exploration
fine,
about the
Patrick.
field,
You're
yeah,
doing
of
fine.
the history of technology. But I find it such an interesting
Yeah.
way to sort of discuss these larger global processes in a way, right?
Yeah. So, if we bring together your two essays, I think, your larger book project is going to get at this too. But if we bring together these two essays, one's from your kind of early dissertation work and one's from this later stuff. I mean, we really have the story of the rise of competitive and expensive electronics and then eventually other things, right? But electronics are like one of the first sectors where international competitions really felt in the United States and Europe, right? Where Asian companies were just doing terrific and continue to do so. I've been struck. We recently were in the process of renovating our basement and decided to get a new television. And I don't want to. I'll start sounding like a terrible materialist here if I talk about this TV. But like, we got a new TV. It's made in Asia, unsurprisingly, and it's pretty big by my standards. It's like huge, but it's not huge according to American standards. Like 55 inches or something like that.
Yeah.
It was cheap, right? I mean, it was like when we got it, it was like it was $450 for this huge television by my standards. And, this is the kind of the way productive capacity has been brought to bear on these kinds of things really has just changed the shape of consumer experience across the globe, really,
Yeah.
But I wonder, I was recently reading kind of debates between economists about like the environment and degrowth and all these things. I'm sorry. It was about whether how much poverty reduction has happened in the last 30 to 40 years across the globe, especially in China and other parts of Asia. And, part of the question and debate is whether we can use South Korea and then later China as a kind of paradigm for growth, because it feels like the story you're telling is a moment or something like that. The post World War II moment from, like let's say 50 to 2010 or something like that is a story of the kind of the logistics story you're telling about global shipping, and then the way that global production has changed in the kind of diaspora way you mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah.
But that now we're not seeing that so much with like Latin America and Africa and other poor nations in Asia, which like Thailand has become very service oriented very quickly as an instance of an Asian nation. So I mean, I just wonder how you feel about that. Like, is the story you're telling a kind of and we're historians, so we don't want to predict the future. That's like part of our nature. And I'm totally with you there. I don't do predictions. But I wonder if you feel like the story you're telling is a kind of a story of a period, in human history where something happened.
Yeah.
And now we're living with the ramifications of it. But it's not necessarily true that it's going to continue happening in the same way, something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and sort of a great way to, I think, in a lot of ways, bring together all of the different work I've been doing. I guess one is to preface, yeah, I don't know if I can make any sort of predictive statements, but I think the story that I tell is very sort of centered in a moment in history, and I think even though my work spans the entire Cold War period, a lot of the sort of key developments, I think, and trace happened during the 1950s, right? I think one of the things
Yeah.
that really is critical for my story is the way that following World War II, the United States had this sort of hegemonic role in sort of the global economy, right? You see most of the developed world sort of recovering from combat after World War II and sort of devastated in ways the United States wasn't
Yeah.
on one hand, and sort of on the other, sort of with the emergence of the Cold War, you see the sort of emergence of the U.S. military as this global player, right? I think these two factors are very unique to that post World War II moment, and this sort of goes along with sort of the work you do is. The key sort of development for a lot of what I'm talking about is the initial sort of standardization that occurs from this process, right?
Yes.
So having the US military and sort of US industry develop into these dominant players in the global economy during the immediate post World War II period enables it to standardize various production processes, but also sort of business and sort of
Yep.
distribution, consumption processes in ways that, on one hand, make a global economy possible, but also I think bring about some of the negative consequences that are becoming increasingly apparent today, right?
Totally. Yep.
Whether it's from sort of the issues of labor exploitation to sort of what's going on with COVID, right? So I
Mm.
think that is a very unique aspect of my story. I would like to say it's not, I don't think this idea of standardization itself is unique, right? I think there are various times and places where sort of hegemonic powers were able to impose their standards
Oh yeah.
on large swaths of the world. What I think is relatively unique up until I think the present is the sort of almost global scope of
Yeah.
this process that occurs following World War II, right? One thing that's really notable in my initial research about the Korean War was how US military engineers were often complaining about sort of work like paving a road, for instance, in Korea that the Japanese did, right? That didn't quite fit U.S. standards. Like the key factor in roads for U.S. military engineers is whether they were wide enough and strong enough for vehicles, so like jeeps to fit in. And
Yeah.
some of the roads that the Japanese built in South Korea, even if they were intact by the time the U.S. military got there, weren't up to U.S. standards, right? So
Yeah.
the Japanese were attempting, I think, a lot of sort of empires impose their standards on large swaths of the world. But what is, I think, I would argue, relatively unique about that initial post-war period with the United States is how it was able to do so on such a large scale, almost sort
Yeah.
of throughout the entire quote unquote free world. So I think yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. I think it is very unique. A lot of what I talk about occurring in the subsequent decades actually is sort of an outgrowth and sort of consequence of that initial 1950s period where you see
Yeah.
the US able to impose its standards on so much of the world.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And I think you answered a question I have about like why we just always find the, whether we look at Silicon Valley or digital technology, like US military and intelligence are always like just behind the curtain. But, the Cold War when the US military is just a huge force on the global scale.
Yeah.
I had a question, a kind of historical, theoretical, methodological question. I don't know how to characterize it exactly, but I was just wondering about how you think about the technical term would be like agency in your story. So on the one hand, I have some friends who are historians of Korean technology, and I just know I get a sense from their work that you have like incredible nationalist myths within South Korea about why South Korea is so great and mighty, right? So that's one story we could tell about not mighty in the military sense, but in the economic sense, right? And that's one story you could tell about one extreme story you could tell about South Korean industry and technology. And then on the other hand, you could have, on the other side of the spectrum, you could have a story where it was all about U.S. military intervention, right? And so it becomes kind of a Western hegemonic force kind of story that's what really creates this change. And obviously, you don't want to do either one of those, right? I mean, the whole conversation's been about how you don't want to do either one of those, but like how, I just wonder how you try to strike a balance between those two extremes and how you think about like the agency of the military actors, and you talk about all these wonderful low level people, not just like generals, versus the agency on the ground in Korea by Koreans.
No, that's a great question, and that's something that I definitely can sympathize with. My parents are always just sort of like, "You got to buy Korean," you know. It's just sort of like there is a nationalistic pride when you see sort of like an LG TV or what have you. I think one way that I've been thinking about it, and I don't know if I've quite succeeded in articulating it yet, is to think about the U.S. military sort of as like, I guess to use like a technology terminology, sort of like a platform. That's sort of how I sort of understood the military, is not sort of necessarily a U.S. actor per se, because what I found throughout my research is there's a whole range of individuals, from the low level players to the generals in a lot of ways, that use the U.S. military, the U.S. military contracting system, which is in a lot of ways, if I want to reduce down to a very simplistic sort of visual. A visual is sort of like this honeypot. It's probably the largest single source of funding, the U.S. national defense budget, that you find throughout the Cold War, and
on the
various
planet.
actors. Yeah, on the planet, right? So sort of that pot of money is being used by a range of individuals. And like what I try and highlight is they're not just in the United States, they're not just Western, and they obviously, depending on who they are, have a different relationship and the level of access to this pot of money. However, it's not necessarily always about the US as sort of this abstract nation state, sort of imperial power imposing sort of its will, but actually sort of it does have sort of disproportionate control, but not total control of what this money is actually sort of put towards, right? So that's what's so interesting to me about people like Cho or Kang, is they are actually sort of as much sort of in control in some senses and interfacing with the same system that you see high level sort of generals and policymakers in the United States doing. There's a logic of contracting and procurement that's very abstruse and difficult and opaque for a reason, but it's a process that many people around the world sort of have access to, and that's what I find so interesting about this idea of standardization. It's sort of the standards are decided by those in power, but once they're established, I think they can be exploited and used by individuals across the spectrum of power, geography, and time. So I mean, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it
but
does.
that's sort of how I'm like thinking about the U.S. military. It's sort of as like not just an institution, but just sort of as this kind of nexus whereby various sort of relationships are negotiated.
No, I love that. I mean, I think that standards create some rules of the game, and then other rules come from other places, and then there's a big question about how the different players play it in terms of style and all that kind of stuff. So sense to me. Patrick, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really excited by your work, man. I just I wish you the best. Keep going. You're telling really, really cool and important stories. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question and the opportunity. This was a lot of fun.